We'll go through public comment first, and then I'll see if she's available. Good morning, everyone. Calling the Finance Committee meeting to order on November 22nd, 2024 at 9:03 a.m. And this is no in-person public access at this meeting. Members of the public may attend virtually via Zoom or by phone. The instructions are on the agenda item. First order of business is to make sure that all the committee members can hear me and I can hear them. So I'll just go around the room. Councilor Haneke.
Present.
Andy.
Present.
Bernie.
Present.
Tom.
Present.
Councilor Walker.
Here.
All right. And Kathy is delayed and Matt can't make it. So we'll start off without Kathy. So I'm going to open up to public comment. For those of you in the audience, if you would like to make a public comment, please raise your hand and we will bring you in to comment. Okay, I see one. Okay, Melissa, if you could bring the phone number in. I think it's Vince.
Good morning.
Go ahead, please. Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes, so this is Vincent O'Connor. I submitted to as many people as I could reach before I had to go home from the library, a one-page letter regarding the allocation of some portion of the budgetary surplus. And what I did was made recommendations for school allocation that would essentially bring some balance to the allocations of the surplus that would not be put in reserves. And so the first proposal for those who may not have received a copy is that the council allocate $200,000 to the elementary school for this fiscal year, and that it place that $200,000 in the base for next fiscal year. That they allocate $400,000 for the present fiscal year to the regional school budget as a gift to remediate recent past student-facing personnel layoffs, and that they include that amount and Amherst prior FY24 regional school appropriations in the base upon which the FY 2026 budget would be based. Then I recommended that the council direct the manager, in the word shall, include the full amount of both school budgets as voted by the respective school committees in his May 1st, 2025 proposed municipal budget, and that the committee establish a timeline to address the anomaly that there is a separate revenue set aside to finance municipal capital expenditures, whereas most school district capital expenditures are budgeted as operating expenditures. So I made these proposals essentially as remediation for the activities of the past few years where surplus are being generated and not acknowledged publicly, and the finances of the town which generated these surpluses were being poor-mouthed to the four town committees and to the school committees as justification for the manager's budget cuts to school budgets. And I don't believe the manager, quite frankly, should remain in the position of making cuts to the school budget. And the way to do that is to provide, or for the council to provide, definitive direction that the municipal budget that he submits on May 1st shall include the full amount voted by both school committees. I have no problem with what happens to those school budgets after the council receives them. That's up to the council, the council is elected, the school committee is elected. What I have a continuing problem with is having a single unelected person make decisions that really belong to the council. They want to cut the school budgets and raise the parts of the municipal budget. That's their doing. They got elected to do that, but that decision should not be placed on the single individual who does not supervise, has no supervisory responsibility, or even monthly activities related to the schools. If we had a system where the manager sat on the school committee as a voting member, it would be entirely different, but he does not. And so, as such, he should have no role in determining the school budget. That should belong to the elected school committee members, school committees, and to the council, and there should be no one in between them at this point who is not elected. So, and I think these are fair ways to remediate the activities of the past few years where surpluses were generated in a manner that I think is highly suspect and was really provoked a lot of outrage. And I think it would create a more balanced approach to any appropriations that may be made by the FY24 surplus. And as a means of remediation, when you take something that is not yours to take by whatever means, you have an obligation to give it back.
Mr. O'Connor, your time is up. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Is any other member of the public wishing to make a public comment? Okay, I don't see any other hands. All right, so I'm going to close the period of public comment. Sorry, hit the wrong button. All right, let's move on to the budget guidelines. We thank you, Councilor Haneke and excuse me, Kathy Shane has joined us. Kathy, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much.
I'll just let you know I'm more limited than normal because I'm logging on with an iPad because my computer is restarting for the fourth time. So we'll assume at some point it begins working. So Bob, when we start talking about the draft, I would appreciate then we can be showing it because I can't easily see it the way I would if I was on my laptop. So however you want to do it, but I'm just saying different sections when we're talking about them. Thank you.
Sure. Melissa, can you put the draft up?
If that's okay with everybody else, I just think it would that we're working off a shared document. Yeah.
Melissa, if it's easier for me to pull it up so that I can edit and you can participate, I can do that. Just let me know. Okay, I'll pull it up.
So as it's coming up, I just wanted to thank Councilor Haneke and Councilor Shane for redoing this. I think this document is much more streamlined and much sort of clearer than we have had in the past, and I think it's I like the approach that was taken, where the recommendations are really, the executive summary is short and to the point, and recommendations are pretty clear. I'm not sure I agree with everything, but let's move on. So in terms of the general budget guidelines, are there any comments on what we have here? Starts well, why don't we just start with each of those bullets? does anyone have any issue with this, with any of these particular bullets? Counselor Haneke?
Yeah, I actually wanted to recommend something else and just talk a little bit. The executive summary is a copy of portions of everything in green later on. It's not everything in green, it's sort of the bigger stuff in green, not the smaller stuff in green. And so in some sense, it might be best to leave the executive summary for the end to
Okay.
see where we are on all of the other sections, because it really does just pop into then the executive summary, and then we just have to decide which of the stuff should be in the executive summary. I've tried to, as I said, pull out some big ones. I know there's conversation about a lot of it. I tried to take a guess, but it really is just a guess, as I said in the comments, of where we might be, so that there is language there. I know in the expense and revenue projections, there have to be some modifications. Because it's not completely accurate in terms of just where investment income comes from and what it's based on. So we do have to modify some stuff in revenue projections.
Okay. Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a suggestion that goes along with what we're doing already, and that is that at points as I was reading along, there were things that were just wording changes, words missing, or ways of stating things. And I think that they might be things that we submit for consideration in, outside of the meeting, so that we can focus the meeting on the policy issues that Councilor Haneke was just pointing to, and not get waylaid by having to, do things like a missing word or something like that.
I agree. I think that our time is better served, and the time of all the staff are better served to talk about the policies. Councilor Walker?
Thank you, Bob. So sorry, are we discussing the bullets underneath the general budget guidelines right now?
I think
Was that the intention?
I think the intention, as Councilor Haneke said, would be to go to the other sections and kind of go through each of these sections, and then come back to the executive summary, because we may change some of the recommendations based on our comments. But if there is something that jumps out at you that we need to focus on, then by all means, let us know. And then when we get to that section, we'll focus more clearly on it.
Okay, yeah, I had a couple of things that I wanted to focus more on, but they were these bulleted points at the top here. And so I don't know what order we want to go in, but I did want to have a larger discussion about the second bullet: do not use one-time funds for ongoing operational expenses except in an emergency. I also wanted to talk about freeze crest staffing in FY26 and reassess the model used for the department. I also wanted, sorry, is this helpful if I just list the things I want to talk about, or should
Yeah.
I just wait? Sorry.
No, that's
Yeah?
fine.
Okay. I also want to talk about, and sorry, I'm not seeing it here, but somewhere that it mentions we distribute the surplus evenly to the three, sorry, I'm trying to find it on here. Distribute remaining budget revenues equally to the four major budget functional areas, area operating budget. It's above the crest one.
Right.
And I also wanted to talk about the more about the budget surplus areas. So I'm hoping that we might be able to find a way in this discussion to talk about like the specific bulleted recommendations that we have also.
Okay. We'll make sure to focus on those. Anyone else have any specific areas that they want to focus the discussion on? Okay. Andy?
I think that at some point we should talk about the question about the amount for OPEB that's a policy change that
Andy, did you finish? I think you may have frozen up. You said it was a policy change for
okay. Other post-employment benefits.
Yeah. All right, fair enough. Kathy?
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, Bob, that what we're getting into is why Mandy suggested we go to the specifics. You know, because each of these, when we scroll down, I have comments on many of them, and Mandy has a revision on one of them. So I think it would be good for us just to move down because Alyssa has flagged, Andy has flagged areas where we likely are not all in agreement. But therefore we would need to have a discussion, and one way to think about it would be anything that affects money in terms of an increase or a decrease or an allocation of money. We might want to consider taking votes on specifics or consider it as a package, because some of this is interrelated with how much money we spend in each of the areas, the revenue side of it and the expense side of it. So I just was urging us to move to, I guess, what Mandy has called the green areas.
Sure. I just wanted to make sure that everyone,
Sure.
there were specific things that people wanted to dive into that I knew ahead of time. That's all. Bernie?
Yeah, as we move along, I'm going to have some kind of general questions about revenue projections, and I'll certainly have some comments about proposed reductions and redistribution of surpluses, which right now are like fairies drifting off somewhere in the midst. Thank you.
Melissa?
I just wondered if we could, some of these suggestions are very specific, and in that way, I think limiting. And so I think it might serve the document and the council's objective better to focus on outcomes, whether rather than specifically on details of where income comes from. Like, what's your objective? Where do you want to land versus how do we get there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, Melissa is talking, she and I had a discussion earlier this week, and she pointed out that what we should be trying to do is provide policy directives that are outcome oriented and let the finance director and the town manager and the department heads come up with the ways to get there. And whether if they can't get there, then they'll let us know, and we'll have to think about what objectives we want to pursue. So with that in mind, I mean, I just think we need to make sure we're not putting as much, we try to avoid specifics as much as possible in terms of we should, increase this by so much or decrease that by so much. Is that fair? Is that fair enough? Is that fair, Melissa?
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going. Like, where, I think too that if we focus on the outcome, if there's, we can kind of steer to that objective. And I hear you when you say you want us to be more aggressive, but maybe there are other ways to be more aggressive with the receipt, the revenues, but also understanding that we have other policies in place that have led us to be conservative all this time. So I think what we want to do is, how do you want the revenue that is available distributed, and how do we get there? And us focusing on the outcome of that, and maybe there are other ways to get to the place that you want to get to, and maybe even at a greater impact, or maybe not, because like I have said before, we will know a lot more in January. So some of these revenue projections are conservative because we're waiting for a decision point on, like, we know what the state's going to provide. We know what our true health insurance costs are going to be. We know what our true retirement assessment is going to be. And all of those things have an impact. And, we'll know what our recap looks like. And that is a big driver of all of our revenues. And so when we know those numbers, then we have a better idea of where the revenues will land. And then when we know that, where would this body like us to focus those revenues? And what are your priorities? So that we take into account not only your suggestions, but other things that we can't be sure of at this moment.
Kathy, you still have your hand up?
Well, yeah, it's back up in reaction to Melissa's. I think I'm willing to do that. However, the big issue that we're all looking at is that in a couple critical areas, and I don't think we should be focusing on specifics, we have been underestimating for multiple years, which is generating the surpluses. So I think her suggestion is that we should be writing this as, where would we like to put the money? Should there be more money in 3 months? When I was looking at the numbers, I was going out of my way to avoid generating a deficit. So if we say we would like, for example, to put the one-time ARPA money back on the base of the regional and have the regional base be bigger for the 3%, that's an increase in the budget allocation. So that's a policy decision, but it also, the way the revenues are set up, that generates a deficit. And I don't think we should be generating a deficit in our guidelines. So I'm caught between, I think we should be signaling that we think we need to redo some of these revenue estimates, and we don't have to say where. So one other point I just want to make in terms of what's happened in the past. In the past, when more information became available, the town office put out how we were going to increase and allocate that to all the departments without first bringing it for discussion. So the council, if we, for example, if there was more money available, would we want to put it all towards schools and leave the others at 3%? We're going to have to put this in this budget set of guidelines. Otherwise, we'll be in a situation we were a couple years ago where the town put out, everyone can get this much more money, and there wasn't any discussion about it. So I think we want to avoid that. So I do know, I think we should be almost where we've got first quarter in, at least on the flow of funds. And I don't know how much insight that gives us. So I'm okay with the general thing, and I'm willing to move on to the green, but we are looking at a situation that for 2 or 3 years, not just 1 year, the revenue projections have been considerably low on some lines that weren't state-driven decisions, that were not the state. Chapter 70 came in a different way. They were internal judgment calls of the town. So I think I'm totally willing not to be super specific, but I think to have this be a set of guidelines where we've weighed in, we're going to have to be, we're left with having to generate deficits if we talk about how we want to redo some of the expense lines. So that's just my comment on the box we're in. If we can't talk about the revenues look like they're being forecast low.
Melissa, did you want to respond to that?
Melissa, you're muted.
I think if you talked about the guidelines in, where the specifics outcomes, like I was talking about, so like if there is more than, like let's just use this example because it's come up a lot of times. We want the 355 back in the base. Just put it in there, right? And then that will determine, you know, and then do you want then the percentage allocation of the overall revenues to be distributed after that, or do you want a heavier weight on the school? And then, you know, what that, and then we can find out what that looks like, so that when there is additional monies, like you said in the last time when there was the extra, when they went from 3 to 4 last year. And I wasn't here, so I'm just, you know, I'm learning today, you know, what that looks like. So that you say no, if there is more percentage wise, we believe we want that distributed not from 3 to 4, but from, you know, we want 3.5, and then and then, you know, a half to, you know, or a quarter, you know, less to the, like, how do you want it weighted versus where's the money coming from? Like, what's the priority? That's sort of the guidance that I'm asking for, because then we can get to where, what you're trying to accomplish.
Okay, thank you. Bernie?
Yeah, I think reasonably familiar with what the Department of Revenue does with recap sheets and projections for towns, but we're a city. So I'm a little bit lost at this point. My concern is, and I'm agreeing with Melissa that we need to say where we'd like things weighted rather than where do we want the money to come from. Because my concern is, how's the DOR going to react to, if they will at all, to us suddenly increasing projections in terms of our local receipts? And what's the consequence if we miss on those projections? I mean, if I was doing a town and we missed on projection, then the DOR would come back to us and say, make it up in next year's budget. So there's an incentive in being conservative, in my opinion. There's an incentive in being conservative in how you project those revenues. And that we can maybe talk about this some later, but I need to know what some of the guardrails are around changing those projections and what the implications might be. What I hear her saying is, tell us where you want to put extra money and we'll figure out if we can do it.
Bob, I can't raise my hand while I'm sharing my screen, but I think what Melissa's saying, the long and the short of it is, it's not within the council's purview to update the projections. That's something that staff does. It's not part of the budget guidelines. And so a conversation about increasing the financial indicators isn't really part of this discussion, but what the budget guidelines might say is that they think the town manager might want to consider budgeting less conservatively than in the past. And then, like Melissa said, focus on what outcomes you're looking for.
Thank you. Councilor Haneke?
Yeah, I'm having a real problem with this conversation that's jumping around 5 different areas at once, because we can't get anywhere if we're going to jump from general to projected revenues to projected expenditures, back to general, back to expenditures. I think we need to focus on one section of this document at a time so that we can actually get to a conclusion. And I would challenge, when we get to revenue projections, I have a challenge with someone saying we cannot guideline and comment on those projections at all, because that is our role as in budget guidelines, to comment on all sides of the budget, not just one side. But we are not there yet. I hope we're still in the general, because there's things there that do affect the rest of the comments, and jumping back and forth, I don't think is a efficient way to manage this conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree, but I wanted to let people have their say. And so let's move on and let's just talk about the general budget guidelines. And in the green, there's really, there's sort of we're urging each department to enhance efficiency and effectiveness. We strongly advise that the town not take on new initiatives unless a source of revenue is identified to maintain those initiatives in the future years. And we advise against a budget that would require passage of a Proposition 2.5 override. Does anyone have objections to those, Councilor Hannigy?
So I do want to acknowledge that I think I deleted something that then ended up in the executive summary, which is that bullet point 2 that Councilor Walker indicated about not reserves with one-time not use of reserves except in emergencies. I think it comes into this not taking on new initiatives unless a source of revenue is there. In other words, don't use reserves for that. But I think we have to acknowledge that the bullet points in the executive summary don't quite match up. I missed that. So I support no Prop 2 over half, and I support putting that into the executive summary. And I actually agree with everything in green and finding a way to say we don't take new initiatives unless there is a recurring revenue source or a projected recurring revenue source. I am okay starting new initiatives that might need bridge funding, but I don't support using reserves for ongoing operating or new initiatives unless in the future there is an identified new recurring source, because I don't believe we should be funding operating through one-time money. That might need reworded though.
If people are asking to make specific changes in the language that you want me to type in, just let me know, because I'm hesitant to put things in here unless there's consensus. And so just let me know when you'd like me to do that.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Walker?
Yes, thank you. So I don't necessarily agree with everything that Mandy Jo just said, but I do like the wording in green. I actually think that it encompasses what I think I heard Mandy Jo saying she would like to see. And I also think it is not far along from the lines of what I would like to see. I'm not sure I agree with the wording under the second bullet, but that's not represented here. I think for me, at least, the wording in green works for me. I'm okay with that.
Paul?
Yeah, so I have 3 comments on this section. One is I want to note that we have put that 13% we picked the 13% out of a range of 10 to 15%. You're just acknowledging that that's what it is. It could be higher. I want people to know that, we said this before, but I just want to be very explicit that it could be higher than that. It could be lower than that. So we are estimating 13% as we think is a rational projection. I think the second thing was the bottom paragraph, Amherst taxes are already high. I think that's sort of it could be a qualitative statement. It's many people feel that they are. It's a choice the town has made to have taxes at this rate. So this seems like a passive, like this happened to us. It's choices that we've made along the way to tax ourselves at this rate. And then the third thing is something I just want to totally recognize this is a council document, so my comments should just be taken for whatever you think. The sentence, I'm not sure what you mean when you say we urge you to examine recent initiatives to reduce expenses and improve outcomes. Is there something in particular the council is thinking about with that statement?
May I respond since I wrote it?
Yeah.
It is a preview of the CREST statements later on.
Okay.
So I thought of it as tying into that. It was reworded a couple ways. I would be totally fine with rewording it to just urge you to seek improvements in all departments to enhance efficiency and effectiveness and improve outcomes, something like that. It could be reworded to combine the 2 clauses into one. They're very similar. But
I just
new
yeah.
initiatives was a direct reference to the CREST one later on in the document, intended to be.
Okay, I just wanted clarity on what you're talking about.
Okay, any other comments? I think we're probably okay, maybe some minor edits on this. I think we should probably put, we should project the health to 10 to 15% or perhaps greater. I think we should put that in there. I think I like the wording change for the to remove, examine recent initiatives. And I want to talk to, I think we should talk to also to Paul's point about the taxes are, I don't know if people choose to pay more, but they certainly are willing to pay more. Counselor Haneke?
Yeah, so I'm taking my own notes. I don't know whether I'm making a final version of this before it goes to the council or not, but for Athena's purpose, I think that is change the 13 to a range 10 to 15. Change the first sentence to delete from to examine all the way to and, so that it starts, we urge you to seek improvements in all outcomes, the first green one. To, I think, improvements in all departments to reduce expense, and then it's like reduce expenses, enhance efficiency and improve outcomes. Would sort of combine them. And then the last I would copy starting with avoid taking on new initiatives, the rest of that last sort of green sentence there with avoid, up to and replace the second bullet point under general budget guidelines and executive summary with that, avoid taking on new initiatives unless a source of revenue is identified to maintain initiative in future years. So that becomes the second bullet point over the use of one-time funds for ongoing operational, to fix those references.
Sorry, where am I cut that and where am I putting it?
You're putting it, see the general budget guidelines, and there's
Yes.
two bullet points.
Oh, you
You'd
want it
be
here?
replacing the second one with that. We're copying it, not cutting it, because it's a
Yeah.
copy.
That's what I was
Yeah,
gonna just add.
she just cut it, Mandy. I think maybe.
Oh, you want it
put it
copied?
at-
It's a copy,
Copy, yeah, it should be a
because the
copy.
executive summary is a copy of what shows up later in the document, which is why I said we need to deal with later in the document and then move them as appropriate up to the executive summary.
You're taking notes on this, Mandy, aren't you, on yours? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Looks it.
Okay, and just a quick note, I because Matt isn't available at this time, I made sure to let him know that to send his comments to Bob, and if Mandy, you are doing a draft, then I'll ask him to send them to you.
Yeah, and I will, and I would like to, I will, Counselor Haneke, if you could send me the revised draft, I will look at it and send it around for comment, and then, give people opportunities to mark it up.
I'll send this to you, Mandy, when we're done with it today.
Okay, any other comments under the
Kathy.
general?
Kathy has a hand up.
Okay, Bob, I just have a reaction to Paul's. I think I definitely want to keep the statement Amherst taxes are already high. Yes, we may have made a decision to do that, but that is a signal that we recognize that, and it goes with not doing a budget override for operating. And just to everyone have a context, Northampton has quite often done budget overrides for operating costs, but their tax rates per thousand are remain quite a bit lower than ours. So I think it's just sending a signal that we are advising against doing that. So I like the way the paragraph is written.
Bernie?
just to quickly agree with the changes that have been made to the second bullet point, and I too would keep the Amherst taxes are already high. That's a verifiable statement. And the intent there is we don't want them to go further. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments on this section? Okay, let's move on to revenue projections. The first green is right,
It's a comment on new growth,
right,
new projections.
right. Oh, does anybody, I think that's fine as the way it's written. It just is, it's a recommendation to reconsider this projection. Paul, are you okay with this?
So I found a lot of information in this. I haven't not verified the numbers to make sure all the numbers and percentages are accurate. I'm sure Melissa will do that. On this section, the third paragraph, it says property taxes are expected to increase by 5.6%. I think that's property tax revenue. If I was a layperson reading it, I would expect my taxes are going up 5.5%. Is that what you're telling me? I think it's a little confusing. If that's the intent of the authors to say it's really tax revenue supposed to be increased that much. I recognize the interest in including the debt exclusion revenue in and then taking it out again. I think I'm not sure if that helps inform the public about what that's. I don't know what the intent of that is. It just sort of, I tried to puzzle through what was the intent of putting that information in there and then taking it as well. It's comparing the debt exclusion. I'm sure there was a purpose to it. And then I think that just a statement, we update our revenue projections all the time, as we get more information. And the next big one will likely be in January when we get the House One budget and get our health insurance. But, as new information comes in, new growth information, whatever, settings of fines and things like that, we update them. So I think that I just want to make sure people know. I mean, you do know that we updated, and that we're starting at a base that we typically are conservative. We always acknowledge that early on in November, and that that's why we show a deficit and we're comfortable with there being a deficit. So I don't know if it feels to me when I read it like it's a static revenue projections and you're saying you should change it. We know it's going to change. So those are my sort of general comments. It just seems like there's a lot of detailed information. I wasn't know if it really makes. I'm not sure what the goal is of some of these things.
Kathy?
I'm not disagreeing with the actual content, to be honest.
The word revenue is fine. I'm just looking at the actual number, and Mandy, I think there's a typo because totally property tax is 3.6, not 5.6. I'm just going back to the actual sheet with that exclusion included. So part of it, this was to signal, Paul, that there's debt exclusion up at the top and there's debt exclusion down below in capital. So we're not spending more on capital. So you are completely correct that it's, so that, yeah. So I think with that change, we're okay. So.
Okay, Councilor Haneke?
So no, subtotal property tax is 5.6. That's the gray line. 3.5, it should be 3.5, not 3.2 for everything but debt exclusion. Although the increase, if you exclude the debt exclusion, it should be 3.5% according to the chart on page 8. So that number needs fixed. But the reason it's in there, Paul, is during Four Towns and during the financial indicators meeting, there was a lot of people, and then at subsequent regional school committee meetings, there was a lot of comments from school committee members that, oh, property taxes are increasing 5.6%. So why isn't our allocation under operating increasing 5.6%? Without recognition that that part of that property tax revenue increase of 5.6% is something that is completely obligated on the other side. And so that's why that is in there, and why I would say it needs to stay in there, because there seems to be a misconstruing of what Amherst's actual increase in property tax revenue is projected to be. Usable property tax revenue for things like operating expenses is projected to be. And so I think this is that balance between information that the manager and the finance director do not need, but information that others might find useful that this document is also directed at. The school committees, the library trustees are all CC'd on this document. And so that's attempting to make that balance.
Melissa?
I mean, I guess this is kind of what I get to. I see what you're trying to do, but I worry that it's too specific, and then we find ourselves in the same situation we keep having about, you projected this and then it was something else. You know what I mean? And so that's my concern, because the increase to the debt exclusion for fiscal 26 assumes that we move this project forward quickly, and that I'm going to have to do a borrowing, in the coming months in this fiscal year that will impact next fiscal year. And right now, as everyone here knows, that project is moving slower than anticipated. So, that's sort of where I go with that. But I will say that I just pulled up the budget projections, and maybe there's a way to describe how the projection sheet looks, because there is a subtotal of the tax levy limit at the 3.5%. And then everything above that gets to the 5.6%, and maybe more of a description of where to look to rather than the specific dollar amounts. Because, if we find out that we're not going to borrow for the debt exclusion before the end of this fiscal year, because the project is moving slower than anticipated, then that number will drop significantly, and then we'll find ourselves having tied ourselves to a future that we, things may change. That's but I get why you're trying to sort of define, but there's the levy limit total, which is the actual tax available for operating increase at 3.5 in the projection sheet. And then there's the subtotal of property tax inclusive of the debt exclusion. So maybe there's a different way to describe it without tying us to a number. But, only in that once we put a specific number out there, people will say, but you said.
But
and I don't know that to be true.
Andy?
Yeah, I was going to move on to another sentence, which is the one that is in green, that says, yet this appears to be an area where modified projections may be appropriate. And then it goes on to say, we encourage you to revise investment income projections. The words may be, and then making direct statement that we should revise seem to be contradictory. And so kind of, I wrote down as, we encourage you to carefully review assumptions and revise income revised investment income projections if appropriate, because it just seemed contradictory. So I was commenting on that one, and I guess I'm a little bit hesitant to go and be directive on a lot of these changes in revenue assumptions, because they are assumptions, and I think that at some point we need to trust our staff to make correct assumptions. And what we really are needing to just grapple with is, are we willing to take the risk that we're going to give projections in guidelines that we're not going to be able to meet when it comes to a budget we adopt in May?
Bernie?
Yeah, again, echoing something that Melissa said, there's this phenomenon called anchoring, which we encounter all the time. And the first number you throw out is the number everyone will remember. They anchor on that, and it gets you difficult. It becomes difficult to move you from one point that you've pegged to another. Andy sort of, I think I would agree. And Andy pretty much said what I was thinking about in terms of this paragraph. I think it's we can't make an assumption that we're going to get 4% on 21 million, and I don't know what our financial advisor would say about that. If I had a crystal ball and could come up with projections like that, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be at my estate in Naples, Florida. I would agree with Andy that paragraph, you might want to substitute for that paragraph a recommendation that the staff again look hard at projected local receipts to see where there might be any trends that would allow for additional revenues on a regular basis. I think that's what I would suggest there, rather than to say increase the projections. The sad part of it is the only money we can absolutely guarantee on is 98% of our property taxes. That's the only thing we can really depend on. Everything else beyond that is variable. My concern is with our local receipts. I don't know. I'm not comfortable with modifying those without knowing what the Department of Revenue might say or react to. So I would be comfortable with saying in that paragraph, we've take a good hard look at this and see where they might be increased. The other thing I would suggest is that we make, as part of our financial planning, a list of projects and appropriation we might have in place should we incur a surplus. So there's some projection of the future that if we know we're going to put some money into reserves, we know we're going to put some money into capital stabilization, but do we have a list of priority one-time projects that could happen should we end up with substantial reserves?
Councilor Haneke?
So this is the paragraph. Well, I want to go back to the new growth projection and then move on to local receipts. So I want to keep the new growth projection urge in to change this. I acknowledge what our finance director and town manager are saying, except in the past number of years, that 650 never changes. It seems to be the number we put in without into the budget without really re-looking at it. And so I think we do need to keep it in here that says, we expect you to relook at that number as we get closer to budgeting time and know what projects are coming. Because maybe it needs to go down, but maybe it can go up based on projects, or maybe it's right at 650, but it's one of the items that has been underestimated in recent years significantly, in some of those years. Same with local receipts. So one of the things that needs to change here is there was a misunderstanding or a wrong understanding as to what that investment income line on the revenue side is. It's not representative of the interest and income on reserves. It is only representative of interest and income on inflows and inflows, I guess, on the budget that does not, on the budget lines that are listed within those charts. So it needs a full rewrite in that sense, to remove the sentence regarding 4% interest rates yielding more than 800,000, because that's not accurate in terms of what would show up in the budget pages that are listed on, that are charts that are copied on 9 and 10. So I think if we remove that line, we can actually consolidate this into a smaller paragraph that does say, this, I agree, this is an area where modified projections are appropriate, because again, every year we seem to be there. I guess there's a dispute within the council whether those numbers are too conservative or not. And so we need to vote on whether we believe that they're being estimated too conservatively and whether we are asking for a less conservative estimate of these numbers based on actual receipts received in the last couple of years. And so I've got a whole potential rewrite here. Not sure if people want to hear it right now. It's sort of a consolidation of the two things that were talked about, but I support putting in here and asking and recommending that we be a little less conservative here. Because if we're a little less conservative, I'm not saying we go whole hog aggressive that we don't think we can meet, but I think there's a little bit of leeway for a little bit less conservativeness that would free up or increase the revenue side, which would allow us to do some of the things we want to do on the expense side.
Kathy?
Well, Mandy offered to share a potential rewrite, which was what I was going to do as well. I think, if we strike the entire sentence, Athena, based on current reserve all the way to the end on the surpluses, that we just want to take out. But there's what we should have first quarter now, or about to have first quarter. We're going to have second quarter pretty soon, by the end of this year. So not only do we have the last 2 years of flow on this, but we're going to have quarterly flow. So focusing on this on an area with potential modifications, because it may be too conservative, is something I would like to keep in, but with better wording. So we don't need to say we recommend this projection be increased. We urge you to revise. I think we could write it less directively. It's since almost $2 million of the surplus was from the projection on interest or investment earnings, this is something worth flagging in the report. And that was the same the year before. So it's not that 1 year we guessed wrong. It's a few years, and it's hard to. So I think a rewrite of this to be less directive and to be looking hard at these as a potential area where we can be less conservative would be the way I think we could reword it. So Mandy, I don't know where you were going to go on rewording, but I think several people are concerned of specifically saying revise this line, and it is, and I'm conscious that Melissa's hand is up. I strongly advise us against coming out with a guideline that increases the deficit. So I do not want to be part of that. So I think we need to flag areas where we think the revenue side may be too conservative. And I would rewrite that whole sentence based on the reserves. That just needs to be deleted. That doesn't belong there. And I wrote it, or I suggested it. So I now understand that all the interest on our reserves stays in the reserves. None of it is available for operating budget. So it just needs to be deleted, Athena, that sentence.
Is it this one?
It's based on current reserve all the way down to the surpluses. That just needs to go out, and then we need to
This one.
figure out
Yeah.
how we rewrite the whole paragraph.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think exactly right that any investment income should stay in the whatever fund it's in, because it's a hedge against inflation, basically. So, the money we put into capital reserves, capital stabilization, if we're making interest on that, then we should keep it in capital stabilization because that's our hedge, or at least one hedge against inflation. So I think we're in violent agreement on that. Melissa?
So again, I'm gonna request that. So one thing I want to respond to is the new growth projections. And so what I want to remind the council of is that, part of what we're waiting for in January is the actual new growth for 2025. And that once that number is put in, that it increases the base going forward in 2006. So that, so unlike the local receipts, when there is an increase in new growth, it becomes part of the overall base and continues into the future. So, the new growth is the thing that we don't know. Like some years it's high, some years it's low, but the one thing that we can count on is that once it's established, it continues forward. And part of what we know in January is what the new growth will be for this year, which is being set currently, in response to the council's action on setting the class in the classification hearing, and now we're trying to set the actual tax rate. So I want to say that the impact of budgeting conservatively in new growth does not have the same impact that budgeting conservatively in the local receipts does. So I just want to say that and acknowledge that and know that, that's how that reacts. And if you would like us to budget more conservatively on local receipts, more aggressively on local receipts, I apologize. My request is that it be general in the whole category. Because if you look back, even on our current projection sheets, if we go back to 2022, which is still on our projection sheets, that interest income was under $150,000. And that's why it's budgeted so lowly. We had to react to the economics of the time, which was really low interest rates on our cash flow operating expenditures, which is where this money comes from. But sometimes when that happens, we can increase in other areas so that the overall group can stay more aggressive. So again, I'm going to ask you, make your suggestion, but be less specific on where that, like in this category, we'd like you to be more aggressive. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay.
Bernie?
Real quick, as they say on the Charles Schwab commercials, past performance is not indicative of future results. And so, yeah, we go back 2 years. That's one thing. When I used to do this stuff, I used to go back 3. Some people prefer to go back 5, but it's variable, and we need to be careful. So thank you.
I was going to suggest that we start this section with a one-sentence paragraph, something to the effect that, the council recognizes that the projections are, will change over time as new information becomes available. And therefore, we can only react to the numbers that are in front of us, but we know that they're going to change. Something to that effect. I think that would set the tone for the entire section, that we recognize that this is a point in time, and we have the best data we can do, the best we can do with it. Overall, these numbers are going to change. And I mean, certain numbers won't change, I guess, or won't change as much, like the property tax number. And maybe we say that, the property tax number is pretty solid, but the rest of these things are, subject to change as more information becomes available.
I'm guessing here as I'm listening. So
Yeah,
if you want me to put different words or in a different place, just let me know. I'm trying to.
That's fine. I just wanted to put something in there that we recognize that, again, it's to Paul and Melissa's comments that these things are going to change, and we're going to have more information. And, by the time May rolls around, we'll have a whole lot more information than we have now. And so we have to provide the guidelines based on the information we have, but that doesn't mean that it's, we need to recognize that these are going to change. Tom?
Thanks, Bob. And I concur with the guidance you were just offering. I think it may have been Kathy earlier who said, referred to a review, possibly a sort of a formal review taking place after the first quarter flow of funds is known. And I guess to your general point about things being subject to change, as long as we are, this may go without saying, but as long as we're expecting that there will be regular review, that would satisfy me. I know that's part of Paul's regimen anyway, but we make some comments here, for instance, about, in one of the green points, urge you to consider whether this projection should be increased once the town has more information. And we expect that if it's changed, it will be increased, but it might be that neutral language, like, whether this projection should be revised, is just as well. I guess what I want to say is, to Bernie's point, I would second that, yes, past results are no promise of future performance. I work during the day as a CFO for a financial planning firm in the area. We get this question all the time. We are using a figure for the coming year of 7%. We draw that insight from Mass Mutual. Both Mass Mutual and we are under quite a barrage of questions from clients right now related to the change that's referred to here about the change in the federal administration. And so that's certainly a subject to change. We expect it to change. And so I think we're wise to acknowledge that here as you've done. But the 7% figure is simply for context to say that 4 is conservative, while at the same time saying we all remember only a couple of years ago when we're nowhere near 4. So we should allow leeway. That's all.
Andy?
Yeah, I think as this conversation has gone on, and kind of reflect on where this goes as the next step, because, the school advocates very much want us to increase the projected amount that's available so that they can have a higher amount as they develop their budget. And unless we are really confident in those numbers, the consequence is going to be they're going to develop a budget that is higher than we can support, and then we have to cut it in May. It makes it's a difficult task to try and make those projections, do you go conservative and then if additional money becomes available, budgets, there's more flexibility at the end? Or do you go aggressive at the beginning and take the risk that you have to ask people to cut later? And I think we just need to understand that that dilemma is out there.
That's a good point. Council Haneke?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring in, we've talked a lot about the local receipts line and I think I'm working on revisions as we go on that one. We can't forget there's another green item that came from, now I remember, that's where I put it in general budget up in the executive summary. But this continuation of a policy that reserve funds should not be used to support recurring revenue within this revenue projections. And I think that's something that Councillor Walker wanted to speak to or comment on. So I don't want us to forget that before and focus solely on local receipts, working on that modification.
Okay, so yeah, we should then talk about the policy that we have now that reserve funds should not be used to support recurring expenses. And Councilor Walker, did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I am not proposing that we change that policy, but I'm not sure that we pass it down as a specific recommendation considering the state of our budget and like the capital plans that we are about to encounter and the deficits that we have seen in some of our operational budgets. I just don't think we should be taking it off the table as an option. Not that I think we should be specifically recommending that we consider this as an option, but I'm just kind of altogether opposed to just mentioning this. Not that I want other wording, like, can we just take this out? And I think if it's helpful, because I think I might not be very eloquent with my words right this moment, because I'm still sort of thinking through this, but I think that this is aligning a little bit more with what I was mentioning at our previous finance committee meetings in terms of we will be coming up on budgetary situations where we may need to be thinking outside of the box in terms of solutions to issues we might see coming. And so I don't think we should be limiting ourselves in how we can address certain situations. Not that I think we should make it a regular occurrence, but I just don't think we should be taking this option off of the table.
Kathy?
Just so I understand what exactly we're talking about, Mandy, are you and Alyssa talking about the bullet that is up in the general, and does it appear later? Because I think is that what we're talking? The bullet of reserve funds should not be used for operating. Is that it's up in general, but it's not in what we're looking at? Is
Actually, if Athena page is down, it is the first sentence of the last paragraph before we get to expense projections is where that bullet point came from. So it was when I moved it into the executive summary, right there.
Yep.
Nope, you just page too far.
It's on page 3. Yep.
When I moved it into executive summary, I put it in the wrong section. Because I think at one point, I think in a prior draft, it was in the general sections, but now it's here in revenue projections. But I had recognized that Councillor Walker wanted to talk about that.
So I think the suggestion, what I just heard Alicia say is it's fine here. Remove it from the more general, because it's fine here because we've got a modifying clause that there are situations where we might need to pull reserves out, which is the second sentence in the green, after the green. So it's modified by if something goes awry, we would in fact, use, and we have in fact done that in the past. You know, we've moved money in, or we've sequestered money. So I think that is what I'm hearing, and I'm comfortable with that. And the question is whether whether it completely goes out of general, or whether this whole paragraph goes into general, which makes it a long thing in what's supposed to be a short executive summary. So that was why my hand was up, trying to figure out whether we're not talking about deleting this paragraph at all. We're just talking about, is there a general bullet? You know, because the general bullet could say, except in an emergency, you know,
Which it does in the,
yeah.
but Councilor Walker, did you want to respond?
Yeah, so I think Kathy is exactly right. And part of the other reason why I wanted to remove that, even though it does say except for in an emergency, and this was also came up in the conversation we were having at a previous finance committee meeting, is what constitutes an emergency. And I think that that's something that we don't all fully agree on at this moment. And so I am feeling like off put by that bullet being there at the top. I'm not as opposed to the wording in the paragraph.
So I suggest we just come back to this so we can get to expenses if we can.
Yeah, and I also want to point out that last year we did use one-time funds for the schools in order to get to the 6%. So we have in recent times, you know, even though we said our guidelines say not to do that, we did it. And we violated our own guidelines. So
Right, we didn't take it out of reserves, but you're correct, Bob. We took it out of
oh, it was different money, but
it's different money, but it's the same principle, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was money that could have been spent on something else. Anyway, Andy?
Yeah, I agree with where we're going. I think that we need to review the executive summary at the end because, you know, the danger of executive summaries, we all know the advantages, but the dangers is that you then encapsulate the entire thing in the executive summary to the point that people look at the executive summary and think it is reading it as equivalent to reading the entire document. And we don't want to do that. So we need to be very careful and just review. So I'd say go into expenses.
Okay. All right. Shall we move on to expense projections?
You've paged too far. It starts on page 4.
Page 4, yeah.
Thanks.
It's 4, yeah. Kathy?
The suggestion well, it's not just suggestion. I would like to change the first green to, instead of recommend that you prioritize, I would like to change it, recommend that you include it in the budget. And yes, this will increase this. And this is one of the reasons I focused also on revenues, in a recognition that there's an immediate impact on the budget line of an additional $366,000 if it's in the base. So and Melissa can weigh in on this. I think there's going to be ample room to do this within the budget. And I realize that is different than what the council said last year. And I'm comfortable with it being different. So that's the change I would like to make in the green, so I would take, instead of you prioritize, and I realize not everyone's going to agree with me. So don't make that change, Alicia, in this. I'm in Athena. So that's the one change I would make in the first screen.
Paul?
I think Kathy's right that if you are going to make a recommendation change, you should be explicit about it in this document. And I think that if that's what the goal of the council is, you know, that would be something we could work on. So that's just one thing. The other two points I want to make are about the very first paragraph. So you say we want to allocate upon the 4 budget areas. And I guess one of the questions we've often had is sometimes in the school district, the elementary schools are in better shape than the regional schools. And if the schools came in and said, we would like 4% for one and 2% for the other, would you be open to that? I don't know if we've talked about that a lot, but we've never opened that door as an option. So it's just something to consider, or you can always consider it later. But just this to me seems really simple, but we also recognize that sometimes the schools are seen as one entity, both region and elementary. And then the third thing I want to talk about OPEB. And while it's not a big number or anything, I think it's a bad indicator to take this out. I don't think it's a huge amount of money, but I think as a talking point with the bonding agencies, and we're going to be in the market a lot in the next for a while, I think it's just not a good look for us to snip away a process that we've been at. If I were a bond rating person, I'd say, well, wait a minute, what happened here? Why did you stop your process of increasing every year? Not a big thing. I don't think it's not going to change our bond rating or anything like that. But we always like having this as a talking point. So I don't know how much value this actually gets over in the course of 4 major $100 million budget basically.
Councilor Haneke?
To OPEB, I feel like this recommendation is, yes, it might be a change in policy, but it's more of the council actually explicitly saying a policy potentially of $500,000 a year for a while, instead of going along with the manager's policy of increasing it by 50,000 every year until potentially it gets to, I don't know what number, in 2032. I don't know if the manager has an end number. I know he's got a goal of when retirement system assessments are done, moving most of that into OPEB. But until then, is there a stopping of that number? We haven't heard a policy other than let's increase it every year minimally. And I see this line as the council saying, actually, we don't like that policy. We want to keep it at $500,000 a year going forward because of all these other stretches recognizing X, Y, and Z. So I don't have a problem with the council coming out and saying something about OPEB that actually gives the manager the council's opinion on how much should go to OPEB. I would be okay with putting into the expense recommendations something about what the manager just said about the schools themselves being able to request different numbers amongst those 2 operating lines. I'm not sure how it would be worded, but I think that's in some sense reasonable, but I think it needs to come from the schools and the school committee, not just the superintendent. I think it would have to be endorsed by the school committee too. So some sort of wording with that. I am not comfortable with saying include the one-time ARPA funds in the base right now. I am comfortable with saying prioritize including, but as with Kathy, I don't want to make a budget guideline document that asks us to do more on the expense side than we have revenues for, to a point where there's a problem. Because if we say include that, but also do this and don't change OPEB and don't do that, I don't want the manager to be left in a situation of, I can't do it all. What do I have to change from these guidelines? And so I more support as these revenues change, as expense projections change, because some of them might go down, hopefully some will go down, in terms of retirement systems and healthcare, hopefully they'll be lowered. And if that's the case, I would rather say, here's your first thing you do with that, and then here's the second thing you do with that, and here's the third thing you do with that. But I don't want to say you must do this when we're not sure there's revenue or decrease in expenses to actually do it.
Andy?
Yeah, question on the OPEB. Aren't we at 600,000 this year? And this,
Yeah.
say 500,000, that would be a cut, not eliminating the $50,000 increase. It's a cut.
Correct.
Yeah, it's in FY25, it's 600,000, I believe.
And
So you would be in the
when you
deficit.
get to the point that Paul was making about the effect on bond rating, I think if there's a difference between cutting back to the from $100,000 as opposed to not increasing incrementally for the next year. So I totally am opposed to the 500,000.
Kathy?
Well, a compromise then could be 600,000 and the policy is to hold it at 600,000. Randy's point is it keeps increasing. The 500 was going back to an earlier, we have never had a discussion about OPEB. And I think it's great the town started doing this, but we are somewhat unusual in funding it this way. So if Andy, if we went to 600 rather than an increase, it gives us $50,000, which is not enough to offset the school piece. So I'll just say that one piece, but I want to look at the interaction with the third green here. I would like to recommend that in the projected surplus, this is what Melissa was asking for, general directions. If revenues come in better or wherever the money comes in, I would like not to distribute it proportionately. I would like to make it for the schools. And then the schools become the schools, Mandy, on whether is it regional and elementary, is it differential, but wait for them to do it. I think for a variety of reasons, when we get back to the municipal budget, there's some wiggle room in the Melissa budget. I don't think the library budget needs to go up by more than 3%. I think that's a good number, especially if we're in the middle of building a new library and the building is closed for a while. There should be there should be an ability to live within 3. So I would like to change the green, and then that allows us to prioritize putting it in the base where the money would go. It gives us, and then OPEB, if we can live with 600,000 and hold it there as a policy, it gives us 50,000 toward putting the money in the base. So I'm looking at those 3 interactively, and I'd be willing to back off because if I can't get a revenue increase, I don't want to produce a hole in our recommendation. I'm not anxious to put a 366,000 more in what is already showing as a deficit. I really don't want to do that.
Bernie?
I agree completely with Andy about the about OPEB and Paul, but I could live with saying we're going to freeze it at the current $600,000 and not necessarily tie that to another area in the budget. I would also agree that because the Senate in me says we're going to come up with $366,000 for the school budget regardless. I would nonetheless agree that we say that that's a priority. In terms of saying that we're going to have if we have projected surpluses, how to distribute them, perhaps make reference to the ARPA funds, and then beyond that, distribute them equally. I'm just leery at this point in the process of saying to the schools, we're going to throw money in your direction. I think we really need to see how we need to give the superintendent and now the new finance director, whomever that will be, the opportunity to shape stuff up and come to us with a reasonable number. The ability to move money between the town, the elementary schools and the regional school. I think that has to be explicit and upfront and come from a concurrence of the two school committees. I think at one point in time, the proposal was made to move money from the elementary budget to the regional budget. The elementary schools disagreed with that. The elementary school committee disagreed with that. I think they need to play that out, and that we should treat the four major areas as the four major areas, and not allow allow the prospects of it, if and only if the school committees, plural, can come to an agreement about how that works.
Councilor Haneke?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Bernie just said. I want to clarify from what Kathy's saying, because I'm not sure I quite understand what she's going with between sort of the first green line and the third green line here. Is Kathy saying that even after ARPA money, say the budget surpluses and all these changes in projections allow the ARPA money to be added back into the base for the schools, is then Kathy saying any additional money that remains available after that to allocate somewhere within expense projections should all go to the schools and nothing to any others to make those percentage increases different beyond the addition of the ARPA money into the base? Or is Kathy saying those percentages will be different because we want to put the ARPA money into the base first? And I think I just want some clarity as to, is she actually asking for the municipal and the libraries to stay at 3% no matter what, and everything else be thrown into any other potential surpluses after all these numbers are revised, go to just the region and the elementary school?
Kathy?
Should I'll respond to that. Well, and I see Alicia's hands is up. My intent was all, Mandy, but at a minimum, I want the surpluses to read first to include it in the base to make it clear, you know, so we say up above prioritize. So the first $366,000 goes into the base, and in terms of the way the increase looks, it would still look like 3%. It's just that the budget would have put it in the base. You know, I mean, if mathematically, it would be more. And I understand the discomfort, and part of it, what was Bernie's tune, just throw it at the schools. I have no idea where the elementary schools are at this point. I was really concerned last year that they easily met our 4% limit because they had ESSER funds. So as far as I can see, based on enrollment, student population versus staffing, there is some room for efficiency within that budget, and I have no idea. So that's my concern. The regional school has a steep road to go, and this would be one of these, what does that first sentence say? Exceptions have been rare, small, and only for 1 year. I would want it to be rare, small, and only 1 year, but I would want the schools to justify it, Bernie. I'm really worried that you can't address the structural deficit that's been sitting there in front of all of us, unaddressed for quite some time. So that was what I wanted to say, but at a minimum, I want to have it tie it to the first sentence, Mandy, which would prioritize first regional school, putting it on it. And I'll stop there, but later on capital, I'd like to have some discussion on the amount of money we just freed up by deadlocking over roads so we've got higher cash, free cash sitting there. The schools, in terms of our notion of efficiencies, parking lot with solar canopies, roof with solar canopies would later lower utility costs. and we haven't had any room in our capital budget to do that. So I just want to flag that as an area that wouldn't be just the word throwing money at the schools, but investing money in the schools as a piece. And we've still got the 6th grade needing to move up at some capital costs, and it's not in any of our budgets. So I just, this is all potentially the 25 budget, but I'll stop. But yes, I didn't mean all, but at a minimum, I'd like say prioritize first putting the money back in the base.
Counselor Walker?
Yeah, I have some comments, but I have a question first, for some clarity on what exactly it means to include the ARPA funds in the base as a one-time payment and what that would mean for future years if we included that in the base, if someone might have some additional information on that.
Alicia, it was only one-time funding, so maybe we can clarify this. If you put it in the base, it's forever there. Right now,
So is it no longer ARPA funds once it's added to the base?
right, exactly. It says the 2025 base of the school has another amount of money in it, and that's what we're calculating the 3% on. So right now, if you look at the way the budget is set up, it's the 3% is calculated on a base that does not include it. So it's including those funds. So it's not meaning that we're only doing this one time. Once it's in the base, it's always in the base. So maybe this just needs to be worded in a way that the FY25 base becomes higher, and that becomes the base for FY26, 27, 28. It carries throughout that time.
Yeah, I think the piece that is catching me here is the mention of it being ARPA funds. And so if we are using the ARPA funds as the one-time payment for the base, then what takes that place in the following budget year as the base funds if it is no longer ARPA funds?
So let me try again. Mandy, maybe we can just reword this. Right now, we're ignoring those funds in all the calculations the town staff has done. They're as if they never happened. So FY26 is on a base that does not include that money. If we included that money, the regional school would get a larger dollar increase in FY26, and that would become the base for FY27. So it results in a budget of 19,403,000, which is higher than what's in the current piece. So I think there's a way to word it that it's as if a gift was made and the gift became part of the base, and forevermore, the regional school base has that money in it. So we can write it in a way that makes it, this is not a one-time inclusion. Once you include it, it's in the base.
Okay, I think that would be helpful, because I think you like explaining it as ARPA funds becoming a part of the base is a little bit misleading if we don't include that background. So I would definitely favor some rewording there. But I also just wanted to comment on the conversation around the third green section. And I also don't really see this as throwing money at the schools. And I really think that as a community that is known for education and our ample opportunities for access to education, that we really should be changing the way we think about funding and planning for our schools. I think that changing the wording in this section doesn't necessarily imply that then the entire surplus has to go to the schools, although I think that should absolutely be a consideration, something that is allowed to be considered. But I think that it allows for some assessment to be done on the needs of the departments before making such a decision, which I think is going to be incredibly important for us moving forward into times of uncertainty in knowing like how municipalities will really be affected by the changes in our federal government that are yet to come and that we have not been planning for. And so I think we should not be locking ourselves up here, especially when it comes to being able to provide funding for our schools. And I also have some questions, and I could be mistaken here, but I listened in on the most recent school committee meeting, and they gave an update in terms of like numbers and students in need. And what I think I heard is that we have 300 plus students in both Wildwood and Fort River right now, which is a very large amount of students. And so thinking about the need to move sixth grade to the middle school and thinking about the fact that we're building an elementary school that I think, Kathy, please correct me if I'm wrong, was a 525 student elementary school.
575, but yeah.
575. And so like we will be short of space if we do not move those sixth graders, it for sure. And then also in the presentation to the school committee, there was a lot of conversation about the high needs that our students have right now. And we have a very high number of IEP students who require one-on-one teaching. And we are really, really in a position, we are losing the ability to meet the needs of the very basic needs of our student population. And that is very concerning considering, again, we have not even been met with the changes that are really about to come down on municipalities, and how will we be responsive to that? And I think that as elected officials, we really have a responsibility to be responsive to the changes of the needs in our community. And I think that we are seeing a growing need in our schools. And I think that we need to address those things. And, you know, we can't tell the schools what to do, how to use the money, but we can provide them with the resources to be able to better support our students. And I think that we need to be putting very serious consideration in increasing the amount of funding that goes to our schools, and how we might be able to safeguard our schools and our students if we lose funding in that area in the years to come, when our budget is going to be very tight and we will not have that option in other places. I think this is a place we need to leave open at this moment.
Bernie?
Yeah, the song remains the same in terms of school budgets. I've not seen a community yet that hasn't, including the ones that I've managed and the ones that I've lived in and been a taxpayer in, that where you don't hear, well, we need to throw all the money we can. I mean, the schools need to deserve everything they can. The schools consume almost 2/3 of the town's finances. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. But in terms of the schools, and schools plural, because we have our elementary schools and then we have the regional schools. And I know people are tired of hearing of this, but the regional schools are a separate government. There are 4 communities that are involved in that. Amherst should not be put in the position of being the sole community to bail the regional school out of whatever challenges it's facing. You know, I worked for 28 years with folks with developmental disabilities, created programs for them with tight budgets. So I'm perfectly aware of the pressures and the like that happen with special needs populations. I'm not averse to funding this. What I'm adverse to is Amherst, in this case, being pegged as the source and the savior of whatever problems the regional schools are facing. We're not. We're one of 4. We don't even have a majority vote. So that's until the schools, and I've heard some remarks by certain school committee members that I think are irresponsible. You know, we'll spend whatever we want and let them figure it out. You know, we need to give the new superintendent and soon the new CFO the opportunity to craft a budget that begins to address the problems. And we need to take a look at that before we go ahead and make funding commitments to the schools. That's all.
Counselor Haneke?
So I'm looking at numbers. At 4 towns, the superintendent presented 2 scenarios that included a 6% base for every one of the 4 towns. One of those was a 4% increase over that base, and another one was a 2.5% increase over that base. We've proposed a 3% increase with prioritizing putting the base at 6%. So scenario one that people said, other than Amherst at the time, two of the towns said they wanted, and then it seems like the school committee wanted, produced a surplus of $178,000 in the projections, again, projections, if consolidation was done. Scenario two, a 2.5% increase amongst the towns on all towns for the year, produced $169,000 deficit if consolidation was done. I've just done the math, a 3% increase, which is what's written into our budget, and if we first prioritize including the base, would produce a surplus. It would basically be a break-even budget. It would produce a surplus of tens of thousands, barely into the tens of thousands, I believe, if consolidation is happening. Given that, we have to recognize that if we add the base in, the scenario of consolidation that the superintendent presented at the Four Towns meeting cost-wise would be met. And we have to also recognize that the schools are not the only functional area suffering from inflation and rising healthcare costs and all of that. And so at this point, looking at what the superintendent presented as a scenario with consolidation that would provide adequate funding, essentially a 3% increase for all towns over a 6% base for all towns, we would be there with our prioritized recommendation. And therefore, I cannot at this time say if there's any surplus left over when all the numbers are done after we've put that extra ARPA funds in to get to that 6% base, that we send it to the schools without having either further conversation with BCG. Frankly, the municipality needs it just as much. And so I would not support anything being rewritten in that third green to change it from proportionally to the 4 operating budgets, except adding in a convening of BCG.
Councilor Walker?
Thank you, Bob. I think what I was trying to say is I'm not saying we need to be the saviors of all of the towns, but I do think that we can set a precedent that others can follow. Because like I said, we're coming up on unprecedented times nationally, but also in Amherst in terms of our budget, regardless of the national situation, we're coming up on unprecedented budget times, where we're planning for these 4 gigantic capital projects. And although we have projections of what we expect might happen, we also know fully well that we could be wrong. And so I think we need to be planning for our projections to be off in any kind of way and what type of restriction that would impose on our budget. And I think, maybe I have a bias here because I have 3 children in the school system and all 3 of my children are special needs and in special programs within the school system. But I am extremely concerned about what this means for their future and their ability to access the resources that they need in the schools. I'm very concerned about other children in this community as well with the changing climate and how their children will be able to access the resources they need to be successful. And I think that there is another, aside from looking at the schools alone and the school funding, there is another budget category that is really affected by these school decisions, and that is tax revenue. Because if our schools are not quote unquote adequate, families will leave. We want families to come here if we're looking to the future and how to make sure that we have the right formula that we're looking at our budget is that we're maintaining our tax revenue base and that maybe we're even increasing that because more families want to move here. And so this is extremely important for our budget and for our future. We want families to move here. We want children to be educated in our school system, and we want them to get a proper education. And so I think part of the challenge in this conversation here and how we're sort of making these decisions is that given our current budget process, the school committee, and I assume the regional school committee, is working sort of in these confines, in restraints. We are not allowing them to just say, what are the needs of the school system, and we'll figure out how to meet those needs. We're saying, this is what you have. What can you do within these constraints? And so we actually do not have a real idea of what adequate funding for the schools actually is. I don't think every single year we are cutting positions and we are cutting programs from our schools. And so like, I don't even think we have a good idea as to what it would look like for us to add all of the things back that we have cut. And so what do we really mean when we say we're adequately funding our schools? I don't think that we have a real idea of that. And so I think taking into consideration those things, maybe we don't make a recommendation that all of the surplus goes to the schools, but maybe we add something that there is a departmental assessment done before deciding what percentage is given to each category, and not recommending that it just be the same uniformly across departments.
Andy?
Yeah, it's a difficult discussion. I mean, there are other things that also need to be thinking about in school costs. One is cost of moving the 6th grade to wherever the 6th grade is going to go, that we hadn't expected that we would use ARPA funds to handle that expense because it was one time, and ARPA funds are one time. I'm not sure that the ARPA funds are going to be available by the time that 6th grade move happens. There are other things that we need to be concerned about too, with one that we talked about the decision that was made in the council the other day to keep the $1 million in free cash and not to immediately allocate it to roads. But the reality is that we also are going to have to figure out, once a decision is made about how to handle the construction, that something needs to happen on Southeast Street in front of the elementary school, and how do you pay for it? And I think the how do you pay for it is still out there, which is why it may be fine to have it in free cash until we have an answer to that question. So there are a lot of difficult decisions, and I'm sympathetic to what Alicia has just said about the needs to think about the kids in the schools. But we also have to know that we may need to be prepared to make cuts elsewhere in order to make that work. And, where does it have to be? And what are the decisions that are going to have to be made? And I think that it's going to come into a crash in this discussion when we get around to talking about CRES.
Let's step back a little bit. I think, does everyone concur that we ought to prioritize getting the base amount, the ARPA funds amount of $355,000 back into the base? Is there any disagreement with that as a priority? Okay. What about the OPEB? I personally think 600,000 is the right number, not 500,000. I think if we sort of keep it at where we are, I'm not sure how many more years it'll take, but if it takes an extra year, that's whatever, 50,000, it's 12 years. I mean, 1/12 of a year or something. So it might extend it by another year before we get the, OPEB covered. But I think 600,000 seems to be, to me, a reasonable point. We don't want to drop it. I agree that we shouldn't drop it, but I think increasing it may be difficult this year. Any comments on that, Kathy?
I would just say we change the wording. I agree. We can change the wording. We recommend holding the contribution to 600,000 this year and into the future. I mean, as a change in policy, but at least holding. So it's not a reduction.
And, okay, does anybody else have any objection to that? Okay, then in terms of the further projected surpluses, I think I agree with Councilor Walker that and other people who have said we should have some sort of an assessment of each department's needs to determine where we would recommend putting that money. I think that way I mean, I don't know that we know what the needs are going to be 3 months from now, 6 months from now. And so it gives us the flexibility to do that. Melissa?
So I just want to remind the committee that the health insurance increases are in the operating budget of those 4 major categories. So even when you say that, 3% is held for the town and the library, that doesn't mean that those departments get 3% because we have to cover the health insurance increase first. And so that those considerations happen every year, even with an even distribution of the funds, because the health insurance increase, which is significant this year, is built into that. So I just want to remind the council of that. And so when you're talking about individual review of the departments, I assume that you're talking about the finance department versus the DPW versus the fire versus any of the other departments here in town. And so I just want to remind people that happens, and that when you do the weighting of the 4 major groups, meaning town, library, and schools, that each one of those areas is absorbing, and not to diminish in any way that the fact that the school departments also have to absorb that increase, and that's something that they're struggling with, but just sort of a reminder of that, and that so know that percentage doesn't mean it's evenly distributed among the internal departments of each of the 4 major categories.
I wasn't suggesting that, Melissa. I was suggesting the 4 major categories: town, library, elementary schools, regional schools. I think that's what we were saying in that third green sentence. The operating budgets, the 4 operating budgets. I think that's what we refer to. Paul, did you want to respond?
I just wanted to clarify something. If we were a year ago and we were projecting 3% at that time, and then we know in the course of the year we were able to show enough development to get to 4%, are you saying in this document that if we went to 4%, it wouldn't be divided up equally? The council or the finance committee would want to review the needs of all the departments. I mean, because that's a really different approach. Because then it really it becomes incumbent upon all departments to make a case to the council for why they should get their share instead of it being divided up equally. Why more should go to one department than another, as in terms. And I recognize that these are guidelines, but I think that it's a pretty substantially different approach to allocating, because we know the number is going to change. We anticipate that one way or the other because expenses are going to change as we say that constantly. So I just want to be clear about what the finance committee's intention is here.
Kathy, you had your hand up?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was a good point, Paul. I think I would be much more comfortable if it came back for a discussion rather than an automatic decision to do proportionate. And I realize that is a departure from the past. Equal is easy. In fact, for all the time I've been on the council, the guidelines have been easy because all we did was take the projections and they turned into the budget. Once we had the projections, that was it. This is the first time we've had a serious discussion. So I've heard that a discomfort with saying it goes to the schools. I think at a minimum, if we do the first green sentence, we said the first place it goes is onto the base of the region. I would like, if we're talking about an increase from 3 to 3.1%, forget it. That's not worth reconvening. But if it's a substantial increase, I'd like to have a discussion about where it goes. And I guess what you're saying is a review of all the budgets would be really difficult to do mid-year. But at a minimum, bring it back to the council because we don't want to be in a position where it happens automatically and we all say, wait a minute, we didn't know that was where it was going to go. And Mandy, I completely agree that the municipal budget had been under a major squeeze. It includes a huge amount of services. And so adjusted for inflation, we really haven't been keeping up with the need there. So I think the debate is about that last line, rather than if everyone's comfortable with going to 600 and then on OPEB and rewording the way that is. The debate among us is on, is it an automatic once we know the surpluses? So the council has zero role other than to say thank you very much, or do we have a discussion? I think that's where the debate is. And I would move off saying it would all go to the schools. I just want to have a discussion about what kind of money are we talking about.
Councilor Walker?
Holly had her hand up too, although it
Okay.
went back down. Yeah.
Melissa?
Sorry, Melissa can go ahead. I just was talking, but on mute. So if I might
sorry.
go after, thank
Go
you.
ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Councilor Walker.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying Kathy summed up everything very well in terms of like what I had intended to mean. But I just was pointing out that most of my comments were in response to the third green highlighted section where we're talking about if there are further projected surpluses, which I think might have been a little bit different, Paul, than about what you were asking about. So hopefully what Kathy said helped to clarify that.
Melissa, did you want to?
Yeah, so I just want to ask a clarifying question. So what we're talking about is that we're prioritizing first, setting a new base for the regional school district, inclusive of the extra money that they received last year. Setting that as the new base for them is the first priority. And then the second line is to discuss what happens after that.
Correct.
Okay.
Holly?
And I guess I'm going to do it as well. So I believe that this second bulleted point or second green line was going to be changed to keeping it at 600 versus reducing it. But, once again, what is going to happen if by some wonderful miracle state aid comes in $1 million to the plus? Is that a recommendation that you still want to see followed if we have available funds to increase the OPEB? Or are you saying that this is your recommendation no matter what?
Councilor Haneke?
So I think we're saying, and I've been working on language. I'll have something, so I think that we can move on to the next area under expenses and then get to capital. We're running out of time here. But I think we're saying add to the base for the schools, for the regional school first, keep OPEB at 600, and if there's stuff left, come to us unless it's below a certain amount. Is how it's going to be rewritten. So there's going to be some ability to come to either, I need to know whether people want BCG or FinCom, so send me, thoughts when you send updates and other changes. But come and talk before you just make the rest of the decisions on whatever might be remaining after those changes are made and after all the projections are updated.
Paul?
Yeah, I welcome the come and talk. I think that's good. I think that's a good, if that's what the concept is. I just going back to last year, if we were at 3% and then we come in at 4%, and we're able to get there, and we were really good at that, at moving things around, and you've asked us to be tighter on the projections, which we will be. It just feels like there's going to be you're going to have a real battle. There's going to be everybody vying for making the case for why they should get a bigger piece of the pie. And I think that's a really destructive conversation to have. It really is going to change the nature of the cooperation that we have had for decades in this community. And I think that it's a real fundamental policy change by the council to move in this direction that can be really destructive, because you're going to be competing departments against each other. And we have had such a great process of sharing information and spreading the wealth. And it's not perfect. People have different needs at different levels. And I have it within my own departments, different needs at different levels, and we try to make those judgments. But I just think that it will open up and it will compel the other sides of the government to start accentuating their needs in a much higher capacity than we have done in the past. So I just want to recognize that might be one of those consequences of this opening, to say we're going to open the door on this. Again, not opposed to the conversation, but just want to be clear that it's going to change the dynamics in the spring.
Thank you, Paul. Bernie?
Yeah, I'm I'm leery of opening this up. I think one of the advantages that Amherst has had, both watching it as a member of the finance committee and watching it from afar as managing other towns, is the equal distribution of funding really does reduce the amount of friction. It also eliminates, I think, some inherent misunderstandings, which I see all the time in terms of public discussion of budgets and priorities. Because we're talking about the town as a whole, not the police department versus the highway department versus DEI versus we're talking about the town as a whole. What this does is it opens it up to saying, well, how come you gave the fire department 4 new positions and you didn't, and we had to lay off 4 people in the schools? Wrong discussion. So I would think that if we could agree, we believe we have, that we should come up with some way of putting $366,000 in the regional school budget, and that anything beyond that gets distributed equally across the 4 major categories. I would be prepared to stay with that. For the record, I got 3 grandkids in schools. And if you did a cost of community housing study, you'd find that the typical single family house with 1 kid in it doesn't pay enough in taxes to support the schools. So rather than get into stuff on a department by department basis, I would favor just distributing this, if there's any surplus, just distribute it equal in the same equal proportion that we followed in the past. So I'm agreeing with Paul Bockelman on this.
Thanks, Bernie. Councilor Walker?
Thank you, Bob and Paul and Bernie. I think that those are important considerations to take in. But I don't think that we need to paint this as something that's going to be destructive. And I think, again, circling back to changing the way we're thinking about things, and to think about this as a constructive process, because it's giving us the ability to make a different decision, but it does not bind us to actually doing anything differently. It just allows us to consider it. And I think one of the most beautiful things about doing something new is that we get to decide what that looks like. And so it allows us to think about ways to eliminate misunderstandings and to think about ways to create a more engaging process where we're in back and forth conversation with departments if that's what we decide it needs to look like. If we decide people are being misinformed and we need to provide more education in terms of how we're making decisions, then maybe that's what it does. But what I'm saying is this is allowing us to do things differently. And so we get to decide what that looks like. And so we can decide that we're going to do what we can to be proactively constructive and to try to eliminate misunderstandings and the ability or the possibility that this turns into something destructive. And so I think that that's part of what I'm hoping for with this process is that it just gives us the option to consider something else. It does not bind us to doing that.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, I'm with Bernie on this, because this whole equal percentage came about because there was a reaction at town meeting to what would happen when one group worked within town to lobby within town meeting to get a higher increase for its area than another area. And it became a really destructive process of battling it out. And we're opening up the possibility that battle will come back and it'll be in the council and not in the town meeting. But, councilors need to be prepared to live with that ugly battle because I think that, history says that it's going to happen. And so I don't know how we're going to resolve this one. I do want to get on to making sure we have some time to talk about what was intended with CRESS and the discussion and capital. So I want to also urge time allocation.
Yeah, Bernie, go ahead.
Real quick, what Amherst does is different. There are very few communities that I know of that have the ability or have had the ability to distribute funds on a percentage basis and then give the elected committees that manage those monies the ability to do what they need to do with them, rather than getting into this discussion and debate about why is classic one from my time in Belchertown. Why did the schools buy new oscilloscopes when we need to fix the doors on Town Hall? Let's not go there. Let's keep up the distribution as we've had. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think the committee has a consensus on this. So I think what we should do in the draft guidelines that we send to the council is point out the two positions on this and leave it up to the council to make a final determination on this. Does that make sense, Kathy?
Yeah, then I would recommend writing 2 sentences here. And I think, Mandy, I think you're going to take the document back from Athena to make some of these changes. If there are fewer, we recommend A, coming back to the council for discussion, and B, distributing the funds proportionally, after the word of priority first. So I think that's where the debate is, just on is there a second discussion or is it blindly going forward? And Bernie, I just want to correct, and I sent you a note. You said schools are 2/3 of their budget. That's old data that you're looking at. It's down to barely half. And the difference, there are a couple things that are different. The charter assessment has been offsetting state education monies, and it's at the tune of 3.2 million that's being pulled out of our budget between regional and elementary. We went up to 10.5 on capital, and we've been increasing OPEB. So those are the 3 big areas that there's been. It's not that other major departments are a bigger share. It's the squeeze has been in the miscellaneous, the sort of another category. So the schools, the formula that the state is using is a particularly hits state aid for education. So there's been a diminishment of that because of that huge offset. So it's in the tables. You mean you can go back and do the division. So we were at nearly 2/3, I think, when I first started as a counselor, or the year before.
Thanks for the, Kathy, thank you for the correction. That's good information, and I stand corrected.
Well, as someone who's looked at this, it's hard to really get a fine tune on this because there's lots of capital that goes into the schools. There's, we use DPW staff to do certain things at the schools. So it's really complicated to try to figure out what percentage actually goes to the schools.
It just used to be really easy, Bob. You just took the two budgets and divided them and came up with the number that Bernie had. But you take those two now and you don't get 2/3 anymore. You get
No. I agree. But it's more complicated than just looking at the four budgets. So anyway, we're still working. I guess the next issue really we have to wrestle with is what recommendations we make regarding CRES. And I know Alicia or Councilor Walker, you had some strong comments on this.
Athena, can you scroll down to that section?
The next set of green.
Oh, it's right at the top.
Yeah.
Go a little bit up so you get the beginning of the of the last paragraph on the first page.
Yeah, there you go. So the question before the committee then is, do we want to recommend freezing CRES staffing at our current staffing levels or not? Councilor Walker?
Thank you, Bob. I don't agree with like this whole entire paragraph, to be honest. I think it's premature to be making this kind of recommendation. And so I'll start just like line by line. We recommend freezing current staffing. I don't think that makes sense in order to do a reassessment, because how do we assess a program that is not staffed and is not functioning? So I think that really is kind of stifling our ability to actually assess the program if we don't allow them to hire, and they are currently working on hiring. And so I think that would not only prevent them from making any future progress that they're already working on, but it wouldn't even allow us to make a real honest assessment of the program if we freeze hiring at this moment. So I do not agree with that recommendation. And then there's a small section that is not highlighted that says we cannot afford duplication of services or staffing that does not yield results. And I also highly disagree with that statement, because this is not a duplication of services. This is actually intended to be an alternative, and we are supposed to be moving services over. And so I think a part of this issue is that CRES has not been functioning in the way that it was intended and in the way that it was written to be functioning. And so some of these statements don't make sense because CRES hasn't been able to do what it was supposed to do from the beginning. And so we can't really say these things. We recommend proposing a budget for CRES and police that include implementation of any changes to bring the budget into alignment with the council's original intended outcomes when it voted to create the CRES department. But a reminder that the CRES department recommendation came down to the council as a separate freestanding department, separate from the police, intended to be an alternative to the police. And so it does not make any sense to combine those two departments. There was input from a consultant who has expertise in creating these exact programs. And so there is data and reason to why that recommendation came down in that way. And the council did not vote for it to be a co-response model or for any of those things. And so again, I just don't agree with that statement as being true. And so I think that it's that paragraph there, not the following, that I have disagreements with. And so, I mean, I do think that I recommend CRES being assessed, but I don't recommend having any budgetary changes until after an assessment is done.
Counselor Henneke?
Yeah, I don't know what I actually feel about this. It was in comments to something I received, so I included it in this to make sure that we would have a discussion. And part of my thinking is, does it belong in here versus in the manager's goals? But I think it might be wise to put it in both, in maybe different wordings or something, because Crest has operated for 2 years. And it's the time where we need to have a discussion as to whether it is working, whether it is producing results that we want, whether changes to the model or not need made to produce those results, whether it is even intended to, whether the current leadership even intends to operate the department as we intended it to be operated. And if it doesn't intend to be operated in that way, we need to have a discussion. If in some sense Crest has already changed its intended intention for what services it provides outside of a discussion with the council, that's a problem, because the council created a department with an intention to provide certain services that it seems like are not being provided and may not ever intend to be provided. And the question I have is, how do we get to the council having that conversation and making recommendations to the manager regarding continued operations on a new department that we can't just create and then let it happen. We have to reassess it. And so what is the best way to ensure that in operations in year 3, it is being reassessed for its viability, for its functionality, for the results it's providing, and for what it is actually doing versus what it was intended to do, which I actually agree with Alicia. What it's doing now is not what we voted its intention to do. And we haven't had those conversations, and I don't know how we essentially require the manager to have those conversations with us in a way that will be fruitful and yield results to those conversations, and not just conversation, but decision points need made. And when we voted the funding initially, we said we needed to fund it to get to the assessment. And well, it's now time to assess whether it's working or not. And how do we make that happen? And I think putting something in here, I don't know what, as well as some strong language in the town manager's goals, is the way to do it.
Andy?
Yeah, one thing before I get to responding to what Mandy just said is in that last sentence in the paragraph that's really pretty much before us, it should say we recommend proposing budgets for Crescent Police instead of a budget, so that they're separate budgets. And I think that addresses one of the things that Councilor Walker was raising. I do agree with Mandy that this needs to be one of those places where we're careful to coordinate the policy goal that we're developing in a separate process in this goal, this section of the budget guidelines, because it's very important. But it is coming down to the fact that it's time to address the question that if we're having, can we ever get to the point that we thought we were getting to when we said, let's create the Crest Department and make appropriate decisions. I want to keep putting money into Crest and trying to do everything we can to make it work, but we have to recognize that at some point you got to step back and say, okay, we've given it our best shot. Can it work?
Councilor Walker? I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, I was. Thank you, Bob. So I actually agree with almost everything, if not everything, that Mandy Jo and Andy just said. I don't necessarily recall what exactly we placed the benchmark of assessment at. I can't recall if it was 2 years, but it's very possible because we did. I do remember there being conversation of having an assessment at a certain time for the Crest department. But I do not think that there was any conversation of freezing hiring in order to do that assessment. And so I'm not saying I don't think we should move forward with the assessment. And I do think it's time for us to have a very serious conversation about this, and that this deserves its own probable agenda item. And I'm not sure if the Finance Committee is the place where we start with this, because I don't think that we can address the budgetary implications without first addressing the conversation about what's going on with the department. What do we think is going to happen for the future, and what do we want to see happening? And so I think that this conversation should happen. Like, I don't agree with this being in the budget guidelines is basically what I'm getting to. And I think that like maybe the council could recommend a realigning of the goals and mission of CRESS, and that we ask the director and town manager to present us a plan as to how they intend to proceed. And then we determine whether or not we think that that's going to meet the needs that we had hoped that it would meet, or something like that. But I don't see that directly being a budgetary concern to be addressed, if that makes sense. Like, I think once we have a result from that conversation, we then see, so what implications does this decision have for the budget? And then we make those decisions. But I think making these decisions before having any of that information is premature, and honestly, I just don't think it makes any sense. And so while I think we need to have this conversation at a larger level, I don't think that right now during the budget guidelines, this is where I want to have this conversation. I think we should just strike all of the budgetary comments about CRESS out and say that like we need to reassess, we need to have a plan, and we need to determine what we are going to do moving forward. And that at that point, the Finance Committee can weigh on the budgetary implications.
Kathy?
I see Paul's hand is also up. I was going to suggest a way of taking all of the green out and changing the sentence to duplication to say we cannot afford staffing that does not yield results, keeping that in. And just in terms of the perception of duplication, it's when CRESS and police both show up at the same events, whether it's a school dance or others. The perception that it's potentially turning into doing work that was formerly done by volunteers with seniors. So there is a real broader resident concern that we're not getting what we thought we were getting. So I would keep this. So I was just going to try to tone this down. We can't afford staffing that does not yield results. I think, Alicia, we need to question the model, and that should be part of the assessment. We've got other towns that have started since the original idea. And so we don't need to say that the model's the problem. It may be it was never implemented, but our CREST director, the new one, the person who I think is fantastic in terms of getting things in order, came to a local meeting and gave a list of the things CREST can't do, isn't able to do, that was longer than what CREST can do. So I think this assessment's urgently needed. So I would, since I think I'm the source of the freezing, I know there are vacancies in the department. My notion is that we shouldn't be hiring new people into a department if we are changing the way it's operating potentially with an assessment. So it wasn't to decrease it, but to say, hold the vacancies till we figure out what it is. And I think it's completely appropriate in the context of tight budgets that we think, I don't have to have that language there if the manager and Crest Director are already thinking this way. I wouldn't do new hires into a department where we're trying to rethink the model, potentially rethink the model. So that is my understanding is there's been high turnover, there are vacancies, there's potentially rewriting of job descriptions. So all of that would say, hit the pause button a bit till we figure this out. But if that's going to happen, I don't think the green has to be in here.
Okay, I'm going to go to Paul and Councilor Walker, but then we've reached the end of our allotted time, so I just want to make sure we have a path forward beyond that. So Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't recommend the freezing language. I'm not sure really what that would mean. If it means hold at the current number of positions, do not hire new people. What we get substantial grant money for this program that requires staffing. So I think that's just it's imprecise language to put in a document like this. I think it's not logical to be in this document, and it's very directive. I think that it's real. I agree with what everybody said. It's time. We've always said it would take 3 to 5 years to stand up this program. I think everyone's in the agreement that doing an analysis of the success of the program and its and how it has morphed and whether it's met projected or current expectations is a fair one, and I think that would be an expectation. I would think that would be more in the council goals for the manager, but I think you could, if you want to mention it here somehow, that'd be okay too.
As I said, I would take out all the green, not the green on the second paragraph, but I would just take the green out. And Alicia, if the duplication of services, we can take that out too. We can just end it with other towns have adopted different models. We would benefit from learning from these towns, period. Yeah.
Councilor Walker.
Thank you. So I do agree. Thank you, Kathy, with everything that you just said, but I also I take a little bit of issue also with the learning from other towns because the CSWG took 2 whole years to do extensive research on what other towns have done with their models. And so it's not that we never looked at those things. We took that very heavily into consideration. We actually modeled some of the aspects of this department based off of what other departments, successful departments that were created before Amherst's department have been doing with Crest. And so again, I just think the real issue is the alignment. And so, I respect your opinion, Kathy. I just wholeheartedly disagree. And I don't think we need to reconsider a new model. I think what we need to be asking is for Crest to be realigned with the model that was intended. And if we give it a real good shot on what was actually recommended, that we might see a different outcome, because the services that we intended for Crest to provide are services that there's a need that's not being met for our residents in this town. And it came from raw data and directly from the mouths of residents and youth in this community that we're trying to meet an unmet need in the name of community safety for these residents. So this is not just like a program for fun. We are trying to meet a need that exists, a real need that exists in our community that we know exists because of data collection. And so I think, again, it would be important at this time to be asking for Crest to realign itself and not to be saying we should change everything, because it has never actually functioned the way we intended it to. So how do we know we need to realign? I mean, how do we know we need to remodel? And so I'm in favor of taking out all of the green, taking out the section of the duplicate services, because this is an alternative. So it's just the wording is just a little bit funky for me. And then also, I don't know, because I do have some conflict in the wording around looking at what other municipalities are doing, because we've already done that. So maybe revisit the CSWG report and revisit our data that we have already collected in the CSWG. There's extensive data there that we can look at. We don't really need to go into that. And I think that we can bring this conversation to the council, and what Paul suggested, think about it in terms of town manager guidelines.
Councilor Hannigy?
Yeah, if all the green is removed, I would remove the whole paragraph and forward that paragraph with some changes that I've made based on this conversation to GOL to put into the town manager goals. Because if there's not a budget recommendation, if it really is a policy recommendation, then I don't think it belongs in here if we're trying to streamline what this document is. And I just want to acknowledge that Councilor Walker and I will just have to agree to disagree on whether we should keep going back to what CSWG said. At some point, you need to say what is happening on the ground and is that working or not, and not hold yourself to a recommendation that was made prior to trying it out, that once you've actually started implementing, that you have to be willing to revisit the original recommendation too. And we'll just have to agree to disagree on that matter. But I think we should remove the whole paragraph at this point from these guidelines and send some of that wording on to GOL.
Kathy?
I'm going to agree with Mandy on just delete the whole paragraph. And just Alicia, particularly when we talk about models, Greenfield has started up a department. Northampton, the world has moved on. So it's not frozen to the time this was first looked at. I think we have an incredible opportunity to open our eyes. But if we take the whole paragraph out and we put it into town manager goals, that I think removes this and removes it. This is going to remove it from the executive summary. So I think that is an elegant way to move on to the next part of this document.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think this is appropriate for the budget guidelines. I think it is appropriate for town manager goals, and it's appropriate for the council to take this issue up. But I don't think it's necessarily a budget guidelines issue. So I agree with taking paragraph out. Okay, so we've got 2 more sections to cover, actually 3 more sections to cover. Actually 5 more sections to cover. I don't know that they're as potentially difficult or controversial, but can people stay till noon?
I can.
Is there anyone who can't stay? Alicia, you can't stay till noon. Is that right?
Yes, I have class at 12, so I have to go, but I do want to be a part of this conversation because I do have further comments for the remaining sections, but I will also let the committee decide what's best for the committee.
Right, Tom? Tom?
Yeah, sorry, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave. I've got furniture movers due here at 1.
Okay.
Showed up at 11:15, so I've got to step off.
Okay, so if we postpone continuation of this discussion until our next meeting, which I don't believe is till December 6th, is that going to work? Athena, will that work for getting the guidelines together?
You don't have a meeting on the 29th? Oh, no, that's the
no,
holiday.
that's the
I'm
holiday
sorry. Of
weekend.
course, that's the holiday. So December 6th is the next Friday.
Right.
I strongly appreciate not having a meeting on the 29th.
I'm not gonna go there
So
either.
when we spoke during agenda setting on Wednesday, Lynn and Paul and I agreed that it was probably unlikely that the council would get through a discussion and action on the budget guidelines on December 2nd. And so we had planned on a first discussion. So Finance Committee will have more time after December 2nd if you want to continue the discussion on the 6th. And then come back with a final draft, and then you'll be able to consider any comments that you get from counselors on Monday the 2nd. Does that sound okay?
Kathy?
People may groan at this suggestion, but I am not going to be here on the 6th. I am completely gone. So I would love to be, if there's going to be discussion rather than just agreement, I'd love to be part of it. I wonder if there's any way we could get an hour on either Monday or Tuesday of the coming week, if there is a time slot that would work for people. And I see Mandy saying no. And if I can't be, I can't be. That's okay. I mean, I realize
it's too late. Unfortunately, it's too late.
Oh, we can't post it, right? Right. The caveat, the window just closed on all of next week. Thank
well,
you.
You could.
Got it.
48. You could schedule something.
Okay.
The morning of the 27th, we could do Wednesday morning.
So
Okay.
can I make a recommendation? There is
Yeah.
one big change that we need to discuss within the Capitol. Everyone else could send me their thoughts, but the one big one is the financing model that is in here. Which financing model for the big capital projects? That's the big one in the section on capital that we should discuss. And the big one on the section in capital surplus, they might be in the, you know, there's a surplus section too, I guess. Budget surpluses is how to spend them on page 7. The stabilization fund, the sort of the bulk of the surplus going into capital stabilization, and then these 3 guidelines afterward. Those are, I think, the big things that we should discuss now. Everything else is fairly generic to prior years, potentially. That doesn't mean it won't change, but I think those are the 2 things that we really need to have a discussion on now before we could send this document on to the council for a discussion.
If we could do that really quickly, Mandy, then I could be part of it. And then the continuation, Alicia can see where we went with it if she has to leave for class right now.
Yeah, Councilor Walker, do you have any comments on this before you disappear?
Yeah, so actually the model choice was one of the topics that I had hoped to be a part of the conversation for, because I do not agree with that recommendation of choosing Model 2. And I don't think we've taken enough time to go through the scenarios and to actually talk about it. And I was going to actually propose that we have a longer period of time to talk about that, because I think that that's a very important decision that we will be making. And I don't think it should just be like, we're picking this one without having an in-depth conversation about all of the models and different choices we have. So that's just about as much input as I can give right now, but I would hope that that's something that we spend a longer time talking about.
Okay, thank you. I agree. We have to talk. We need. I'm reluctant to try to rush this through. I think if people have specific comments, please send them to Councilor Haneke, and she can, you know, even if we have like 2 or 3 potential wordings for things, we can, you know, at this point we have a draft, or we can say we disagree with this for this reason. But I would agree that the models, it's I mean, they were introduced at the council meeting, and it's, you know, I haven't had a time to really think about them as much as I needed to. So Kathy?
I'm fine with that, and I will send my comments. The other question I had just is on timing. Paul wanted on the models, on the major projects, he was hoping for 2 decisions by the end of the year. One is, are we okay with the selection of where DPW and fire will go? And the other was a potential selection of the model. If we pull the model out of this, do we have a finance committee meeting where I can be part of it and do it, or does it need to be in this document? It's just a question of timing. So the next meeting of this group will be the 6th, and then we've got a meeting. I'm just looking at the December calendar. If we can't, we can't, and I'll just send my written comments and on my thoughts about it. So we're scheduled for, right now we're scheduled for the 3rd of December, not the 3rd, forget Fridays, the 6th. I think I'm looking at the calendar and answering my own question. If you don't discuss it, then the finance committee won't have time to discuss it for the council to get a recommendation. So whether it's in this document or not, we're not going to have time. So I'll send my comments in. I don't see any calendar wiggle room unless we set up another meeting the week of the 17th.
What about the 13th? Are you going to be gone too then, Kathy?
Well, I'm flying back. So I scheduled this. I had hoped we'd be further along when I scheduled this, but I'm flying back. So but there is a point at which, I'm flying back, and it's not going to work because the flight leaves at 9 in the morning.
No, it doesn't work.
That doesn't work.
No.
So I'll read what's written. I'm getting this draft of this along with everyone else, and I will put my thoughts in words with, if I have suggested changes in the wording, I'll make the suggestion in a document. I'll send it through to you, and then Mandy can just have it as a potential change rather than incorporating it.
Okay.
She'll be the keeper of the document, I'm hoping, yeah.
Counselor Hanke?
A few things. I think we need to revisit our meeting schedule because we have scheduled meetings that a committee member cannot make, and I think that's wrong. I think we need to add at least one meeting, either the week of the 9th or the week of the 2nd, because we still have council orders to get through. The budget guidelines, which should be adopted by the end of the year. The last meeting for that adoption is the 16th. So
16th.
adding a meeting after the 16th doesn't help us with that. So I think we need to have more meetings scheduled for the week of the 2nd or add a meeting on the week of the 9th to do this.
And Mandy,
Wait, but my understanding is that the schedule for the meeting on the 2nd is to discuss the financing plan, I think, or is that the 16th for the financing plan? I can put a placeholder into the guidelines for when the council discusses that financing plan too, with potential wordings for each model. If people send me from finance which model they prefer, I can draft language for both. I think there's one paragraph that talks about the capital improvement plan with the model. I think that paragraph is applicable no matter which model's taken, about the 3 million and fitting it in, no matter which model we pick. So it's really just the one paragraph about which model is taken and the reasons why we recommend that model. I can draft a couple of different options for that depending on what models people would want us to discuss. And then I need some thoughts on the budget surpluses section, particularly any guidelines for surpluses, to draft some sections there. I think if people send me stuff, they need to send it to me by Sunday night, because I think Athena's going to want a draft for the council for budget guidelines to go in the packet. What time on probably Tuesday do you want me to send that to you so I can make the packet, not Wednesday? So I need everything basically by Sunday night or so. Earlier is the better so that I can make sure Athena can get to it before she's off for the holiday.
We're asking for documents by Tuesday at noon. So if you can do that, if not later in the day on Tuesday or first thing on Wednesday, I can still add those to the packet before I'm away. And then there was also a question, Bob, if I may continue.
Yep.
There was a question, Mandy, you had asked a question about the discussion of the financing model, when that was going to be discussed. We assumed that that was going to be part of the conversation about the financial guidelines. And so right at this moment, and it's, depending on how quickly Finance Committee gets through this and what you're ready to present to the council. But we had anticipated a first discussion on the budget guidelines, including the financing model on the 2nd, and then adoption of the guidelines, which include the financing model, on the 16th. So if you're able to schedule a meeting after the 2nd to revisit those things with the council's feedback, then I think that would be great.
Well, we have a finance meeting scheduled for the 6th.
and the 27th is out. Wednesday morning was floated as it's within the 48-hour rule.
I can meet Wednesday morning. I don't know that other people can.
It's possible for me.
So if we don't make a decision right now, Bob, could you poll us? Alicia's gone, but if that it might get to at least closure on this draft of the guidelines and allow us to have an initial discussion, because it's so that I'm completely fine on that morning. So
yeah,
anytime.
All right, I'll see what happens. See if people are available. Say 9 o'clock on the 27th.
It might be wise to potentially post it while you're surveying so that you don't miss the posting deadline. If you decide to go forward with it, you can always cancel.
That would be
Yeah,
good.
I could make I can make that meeting.
Andy,
I guess
Andy, could you?
Not thrilled, but the answer is yes.
Now, I hate to distort the committee for my personal fun travel, but it's the first time I've requested it. Just this, we're getting bunched up every year with this, with guidelines coming so late. So if we could, that'd be great. So Mandy, your suggestion is go ahead and post it, and then the only person we're not hearing from is Alicia right now, right? In terms of voting members.
Well, yeah, well,
We don't even have, we don't have,
Matt,
we don't have Matt or
we don't
Tom.
have Matt or Tom.
Yeah.
We're-
Okay. Thank you all.
Okay, so guess that's probably all we have time for. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to adjourn. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a
Yes.
motion to adjourn.
No, second.
All right, I'm an aye. Andy,
Aye.
Councilor Haneke,
Aye.
Kathy,
Yes,
Bernie.
certainly.
Okay, I think it's unanimous for the folks that are still here. Thank you all for joining us and for hanging in there as long as you did.
Thanks.